to the press conference of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity. As we are in the middle of the week of the negotiations, the IIFB would like to present their views and perspectives on how the negotiations are going on, as well as to highlight the main concerns that indigenous peoples and local communities have that they want to be reflected in the GBF. So we are joined by several of our IIFB members to present these views, and the first speaker on the list is Joji, who is an Ibaloy and Igorot from the Cordillera, Philippines. Joji, please.
Thanks, Mimi, and thank you for this opportunity to provide some of our views about the current negotiations of the post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. So actually, if we look at what's happening around today in this venue, it is the governance of nature that is the subject of the post-2020 global. And if we unpack further the content of these negotiations, it is actually about who will have the power to decide about the future of nature and peoples. And for example, one of the key areas of negotiation is will human rights actually be respected by all of the parties when they are making these decisions? And even that is not yet fully agreed, how this will be, how human rights will be respected, protected, and fulfilled. But let us go a little bit further on this issue of governance of nature. Because whenever we talk about governance, we're actually dealing with relationships, right? So indigenous peoples and local communities are here because we feel that we are part of nature. We have a reciprocal relationship with nature, and that is actually what will deliver and what has brought about remaining areas of high biodiversity. There are others in the room, and it is actually the prevailing framework of parties and even the UN system that what we're talking about is the use of nature. How can nature provide benefits to people? And of course, that is one of the prevailing relationships that exists. Right? We also have conservation organizations, and those are primarily concerned with the conservation of nature, but see nature as distinct and as separate, and its intrinsic values need to be protected. And whilst it is said that that view of nature as pristine and separate from humans has already changed, in fact, that continues to be the framework of a lot of protected areas, particularly when they are state-managed protected areas. So really here, it is actually the relationship between peoples as within our social and political systems, and also the relationship between our systems and nature and natural ecosystems. Now, we have been brought to the biodiversity crisis because our systems in the past have considered nature as cheap, can just be used cheaply, and also that people are cheap. They can just be disregarded and not considered in the extractive uses of nature. So these were the systems of colonization, and even the systems that prevail today, whereby a lot of power is centralized, of course, in the states, and it is really a state negotiation that is taking place in the different groups. Of course, it is now understood that indigenous peoples and local communities are actually those who have delivered best in the state of biodiversity, and also in addressing what needs to be transformed in terms of our social relationships, in terms of more equitable decision making for those who are actually living with nature, and how will that, again, that power be shared? That is actually the nature of a lot of the discussions. How will resources be divided? Who will provide this, etc., right? So indigenous peoples are here to voice these views, to bring additional approaches, views, cultures, and values to the negotiations themselves, and to actually get this reflected in the post-2020 framework in order that we will eventually indeed meet the vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050, right? But these values, that should not remain just a vision. This has to be embodied in our everyday lives and in the everyday practices of our systems and institutions. And this is where there is big, great difficulties because of the continued business as usual, I think we can call it that, of these institutions. And that business, as one of the biggest actors, are actually finding new ways of further using cheap nature and cheap people and calling it a nature-based solution, right? So a lot of the words that are being used in the negotiations need to be unpacked and understood to see how they actually play out in realities on the ground, whereby even as our new strategy is being discussed, people are being violently removed from their territories for the further expansion of within national parks of business, for example, hunting and game reserves. So I just wanted to bring into the conversation how we actually understand the nature of these negotiations and what are the nitty-gritty details that are being discussed. Whilst the final text is still to emerge, that is actually the nature of the negotiations and relationships existing within these groups. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joji. I think it's important that we frame the discussions with those values of indigenous peoples in mind, because this is what makes indigenous peoples and local communities distinct, and this is what we bring to the table. The next speaker on the list is Aslat, the Vice President of the Sun Council from Finland. Aslat.
Hello everyone, and welcome on my behalf as well. So, a few general remarks at first on the progress that is taking place or is not taking place. I think I have to note that in some of the areas the progress during these days has been very slow, and that does bring a worry if there will be too much workload left to the COP, and if we will be able to finalize everything in time and have a proper biodiversity framework that would bring the change that we need. So I think there will be a lot of work remaining this week, but also, however this week is spent, I think the COP will be quite heavily loaded with tasks. I've been following mainly the contact group 3 and focusing on target 9, and those negotiations were only started. There was just half an hour allocated for that discussion. I can quickly say, based on that half an hour, that I was not very happy of the changes that were taking place, and comparing to the language on the first draft. I think the current text that we're working on is very commodifying and not taking into account the various values that nature has to indigenous peoples and local communities. Because now at the very beginning of the text there is language on on enhancing contributions of bioeconomy and bio-based products. So this is very different to what the language was previously, which was more focused on sharing the benefits equally, and there was emphasis on different kinds of benefits that people get from use of various species, including social and cultural benefits, food security, water security. So currently there is work to be done on getting emphasis also on other aspects of the use of species than just the economic aspects. So as I see, our main aim with this Target 9 and also other targets related to sustainable use is ensuring that our traditional practices will not be criminalized. So we are working on having a safeguard language, specifically in relation to customary sustainable use. We don't think that just the word safeguarding or protecting would be enough, because it is in a way quite passive language. It's protecting against negative impacts, while a lot of our customary practices have already been negatively impacted. So we would wish to see language of the convention from the Article 8J, which talks about promotion of our customs knowledge and practices. So we would really wish to see more of a proactive language that would both protect and promote our customary sustainable use. And that is very much related to what Joji was saying on the negative impacts of conservation. So we'll have to have a holistic approach and think of conservation as well as sustainable use. So as I see, there is a big workload ahead regarding finding the right balance on having proper human rights language in the BBs, but also seeing how the balance will be with different targets and goals. And then, of course, looking at the bigger picture, the question remains: will this biodiversity framework bring us the transformative change that is really needed to halt the current trends in biodiversity loss? And again, there I think a lot of work remains to be done, and we would need the parties to be willing to be much more ambitious in their targets, and not only ambitious, but actually bring concrete actions that would lead us towards the changes that we need. But yes, we will of course continue to be engaged in this process, and as we often highlight, is that the majority of biodiversity is in territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, which in other words means that there is very much to be protected in our areas, and that's the work that we are doing here. Thank you.
Thanks, Aslat. Of course, indigenous peoples are not adverse to having hard work. It's only frustrating that with all the work and energy that we bring in, apparently there's no urgency among the parties, and I can feel your frustration. Anyway, the next speaker is from Edith, from the Pasto people of Colombia. She will be speaking in Spanish, so you need to put on your headphones. Edith, please.
Oye la traducción.
Muy buenos días. Muy buenos días con todas las presentes, todos los presentes. Para los pueblos indígenas es muy importante estar participando en las negociaciones del marco de diversidad posterior a 2020. Tenemos varios temas que son de muchísimo interés para nuestros pueblos en las diferentes metas. En nuestro caso estamos siguiendo de manera particular las metas 20, 21 y 22, en donde consideramos que el conocimiento indígena es suficientemente importante
para estar a la altura de otros conocimientos para la toma de decisiones. Sin embargo, somos enfáticos los pueblos indígenas en que no estamos de acuerdo con que el conocimiento quede expuesto al público para que todos puedan acceder sin ninguna regla. Entonces esperamos que el conocimiento sea protegido en los términos del artículo 8J y también en concordancia con otras normas internacionales que recogen los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, como la Declaración de Naciones Unidas sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y otros instrumentos que han avanzado en el reconocimiento de los derechos. De igual forma, consideramos que la meta 21 debe referirse exclusivamente a la participación de los pueblos indígenas, teniendo en cuenta el rol tan importante de nuestros pueblos en la conservación de la diversidad a través del conocimiento indígena. También nos parece importante que varios estados han apoyado que se incluya el derecho de los pueblos indígenas a la información y también a la justicia ambiental. Eso nos parece que son avances que se están dando en esta negociación. Igual consideramos que tiene que haber una meta 22 exclusiva para las mujeres, las niñas y las jóvenes. Está documentada la contribución de las mujeres y especialmente de las mujeres indígenas a la conservación de la diversidad biológica. Concordamos con que en el marco tienen que participar otros actores, pero sabemos que hay otras secciones como la BEBIS en donde puede estar la participación de otros actores, que también es importante. En este marco pues alentamos a que las partes lleguen a un consenso sobre estos puntos que se están planteando, de una meta 21 específica para los pueblos indígenas, una meta 22 específica para las mujeres, en donde se respeten también los derechos de los pueblos, a la información, a la justicia ambiental y la protección de los defensores ambientales. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Eddie. Our next speaker is Ruth from the local communities. She's from Antigua and Barbados.
Good morning, it's good to be here sharing. I want to thank the UNCBD for giving us this space. I consider it a convention that gives IPLCs a voice. As a messenger from local communities, part of the IPLC working with the IIFB, at this negotiating meeting, we are pushing for more inclusive and participatory processes to meet the GBF, which requires all of society, all of government, leaving no one behind. It requires that our actions, our voices be included in every decision-making process. I have been following resource mobilization. We had a donor roundtable. There have been individual conversations going on with donors. And I am optimistic that going forward, the financing will be channeled down to the local communities who are doing so much actions on the ground. We live in territories, we live in communities where we stop the harm, we are proactive, we are alarmists. When we see danger, we open our mouths. And so that partnership and collaboration with states must take place so that our role as the guardians of nature, as the environmental defenders, should be heard and should be protected. So my appeal going out, wherever this press release is being heard, is to work with us. Give us a chance to build these partnerships that can create lasting, sustainable actions for biodiversity, because our work at the local level just not only impact biodiversity, it impacts climate change, it impacts pollution, waste, mercury, all the threats that we are facing today. So we want to really build strong networks. Work with us. and we will make your life easier. Your work as parties will be easier when you work with the IPLCs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I think that was very clear. And our next speaker is Amaya Cachiquel from Guatemala and the IIFB co-chair, Ramiro, please.
Gracias, buenos días a cada uno de ustedes, a los que están presentes en la sala y los que nos ven en la línea. Hoy en el calendario maya marca el día batzinr y es el día de hilar, es el día de tejer y es precisamente lo que las partes y los que estamos aquí presentes debemos de hacer con el post-2020. Es manera de que nos unamos, es la forma en que debemos de actuar. Hoy tenemos un reto grande en nuestras manos, particularmente los estados que están tomando las decisiones en esta reunión que se desarrolla en Nairobi. Y el reto es realmente tener un marco por 2020 de biodiversidad que realmente reconozca y garantice, ¿sí?, que se implemente esas prácticas de los pueblos indígenas. Hoy tenemos el reto de que tener un marco que promueva y garantice realmente la conservación de la biodiversidad. Necesitamos, ¿sí?, los seres humanos, el planeta y el universo necesitan un marco por 2020 que realmente promueva esa biodiversidad. No vamos a tener otra oportunidad. Estamos condenando al planeta, ¿sí?, estamos dañando a nuestra madre tierra y no podemos continuar de esta manera. No tenemos que ver un marco de biodiversidad políticamente, tenemos que ver un marco por 2020 que realmente se operativice y tenga acciones concretas en el territorio. Tenemos que construir políticas globales que realmente se implementen a nivel local. Las comunidades, los pueblos indígenas, las mujeres, hoy estamos haciendo un llamado a que el marco por 2020 reconozca los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, que se reconozcan esos territorios indígenas donde existe el 80% de la biodiversidad. Necesitamos que se reconozcan esos sistemas de uso, manejo y conservación de los recursos naturales, que se reconozcan esas formas de organización propia indígena, que se reconozcan esos sistemas que hoy son una alternativa para la humanidad. Es importante tener un marco que realmente reconozca esos derechos indígenas. Los pueblos indígenas son una alternativa para conservar la biodiversidad. Los pueblos indígenas han desarrollado y han trasladado de generación en generación esos conocimientos tradicionales que deben de reconocerse y deben de estar presentes en este marco del POL 2020. Realmente hacemos un llamado a los tomadores de decisión en esta reunión de Nairobi, que es el momento de reconocer esos derechos. Los pueblos indígenas estamos hablando por nosotros, pero estamos hablando por la humanidad, donde todos somos partes. Estamos hablando de esos recursos de nuestra madre naturaleza y nuestra madre tierra. Es momento de hacer un alto y repensar nuestras acciones, individuales, colectivas, por país y a nivel internacional. Muchas gracias. Mateos Chile.
Thank you, Ramiro. I know that there has been a lot of interest on the events that are happening with our relatives across in Tanzania, the Maasai people, and we have a statement of solidarity which will be read by Soledad.
How could it be that we possessed and protected this land for millennia, and this sacred link is in danger to disappear from Tanzania history in nearly 60 years? We, the Maasai community, have been the ascendant of people of the Serengeti and its adjacent frontiers. and we possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation. Today, our land in Loliondo is being taken from us without consultation and consent. We demand to be heard. Our homeland has been turned into a hunting park with the wealthy coming to hunt the wildlife. We have witnessed this killing of wildlife for fun since 1992, when the royal family from Dubai was given an open-ended license in our village lands. The guns are now turned to us, we, the very people who have taken care of the environment and shared harmony, food, and peace with wildlife for time immemorial. We have resisted this plan of hunting park in the best interest of our land security and environment since it was proposed. On the 10th of June, our villages in Loliondo were invaded and occupied by the military. We have been shot, harassed, injured, and especially women. Thousands have been displaced. We cannot tell the world of the happenings because media is banned from covering our story. If we lose this land, then it will mark the end of us. We won't be able to practice our ways of life, will affect our spiritual and sacred connections, and therefore extinction. We seek for global community support through standing with us and push our government to stop the violence. Withdraw army in our land and initiate an equal dialogue as a peaceful way of addressing diverse interests while protecting our human and land rights. With substantive and legal recognition of our traditional way of life and its contribution to the sustainability of the Serengeti ecosystem, we believe this ancient autonomy can shine through as a full expression of the Tanzanians' nationhood. We seek to be recognized so that we take a rightful place in our country. When we have power over our destiny, then our children, our environment, and our future will flourish. Thank you.
Thanks, Solalei. And as to close the panel speakers and to connect all of those discussions with what is happening in Tanzania, I call on Jean, who is Kankanaga Igorot from the Philippines. Jean, please.
It's heartbreaking always to hear about what is happening in Loliondo. But it's more heartbreaking actually to hear, if our brothers and sisters here were given a chance, we would hear that it is a common occurrence all across the globe. Indigenous people's territories taken for conservation, resulting in massive human rights violations and evictions. And this is why we are here. This thing needs to stop. And this is the purpose of our engagement here. This is why we make it a point to bring Indigenous peoples here so we are able to participate and able to bring these situations to the attention of the world and to the attention of the negotiators. This cannot be allowed to continue. There must be something done within the negotiations taking place to recognize these rights. Currently, Target 3 is being discussed. I had to step out from negotiations. And one thing that you will realize is that there is huge interest around the issue of conservation. They tried to put us in a very small room for 30 people only, and we were all standing, sitting, occupying every single inch of the room. That signifies huge interest, so it's good that they transferred it now to the bigger room. But it's really frustrating that the urgency is not there. We're spending hours talking about little words. What's the right word to use? What's the right punctuation to use? While people in Loliondo get killed, and in a World Heritage Park in Asia, for example, in Thailand, they are finding their leaders in barrels under the lake. So how can we allow this to continue? How can we continue to debate on whether we use seas or oceans when people are getting killed in the name of conservation? And I apologize, but it gets frustrating sometimes in these international spaces, and we spend so much time doing nonsensical things, and the urgency is not felt. So what do we do now? One ray of sunshine from the Geneva meetings is that we were witness to unprecedented support for Indigenous peoples. Now here in Nairobi, we are hoping that this is surveys. We're hoping that all these commitments, all those who committed to support Indigenous peoples stand firm as we move towards the end of the negotiations. We need to keep Indigenous rights in the targets. We need to have good guidance on implementation that includes Indigenous peoples' rights. We need to have the correct indicators. For example, we know that Indigenous peoples who have secure tenure over their forests, their lands, and their ecosystems are better guardians. They're better able to resist activities that degrade the ecosystem. Therefore, a key indicator must be secure tenure of Indigenous peoples in their lands. Languages need to be protected. As Aslat said, customary sustainable use, and we must be able to continue to use our traditional knowledge. So all of these discussions here should be informed by the reality. And if they only look outside their windows, we hope that they can see the urgency and that they realize that all this quibbling on little words should stop. We should move very quickly now towards a solution that will enable Indigenous peoples and local communities and the rest of the world to arrest biodiversity loss, to address climate change, and to save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. We can now proceed to the open question and answer. Are there any questions from the floor before we take questions from those online?
Morning everyone, Naftali is my name, from Kenya, but working for Chinese state media, Xinhua News Agency. I just want any member of the panel to answer me in terms of the specific concerns or issues that you want included in the final text that will be approved on Sunday.
Who would like to respond?
For specific text, when we thought specific issues. Oh, within the, for specific issues, it's important, as I said earlier, it's important to make sure that violations of Indigenous rights in the name of conservation don't continue. So it's important for traditional territories of Indigenous peoples to be respected and to ensure consent whenever protected areas or World Heritage sites or conservation areas are brought into Indigenous territories. I think this is one very important way to ensure that the example we heard does not continue.
There's somebody.
I think I already brought quite concrete language regarding this target on customary sustainable use. We think that there should be wording that would ensure that our customary practices, our cultures and communities are not negatively impacted by conservation, and that we are allowed to keep practicing our sustainable livelihoods. So we would wish to see this language on protecting and promoting practices that are proven to be sustainable.
Are there more questions from the floor? Otherwise, we can go to a question that was shared by a freelancer from Tanzania. How does the conservation of biodiversity balance with the life of Indigenous people who depend on it for their livelihood? Anyone on the panel? Joji?
Actually, biodiversity and cultures are completely interlinked, right? So the people who are living with nature are actually have fostered biodiversity itself. This needs to be fixed in the current framework of the post-2020 biodiversity strategy, because the way it is framed has still created this division between nature and peoples. And it is actually that very close relationship that needs to be strengthened and supported throughout this framework. And this is, the Indigenous peoples and communities are the ones who are showing the living examples of how this will be the best way forward. But all peoples actually need to renew and revive that relationship with nature, right? So when negotiators are so divorced from nature, and businesses who see it merely as resources, that type of relationship with nature is broken. And indigenous peoples are showing that there are other ways of working with nature, and that we should be working together, because this is what will actually eventually address this big crisis of biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, and extreme inequality. It's this extreme power inequality that is also driving this sort of unsustainable decisions.
Sí, creo que está ampliamente documentado cómo los actuales modelos de desarrollo están llevando al mundo prácticamente a la extinción. El calentamiento es cada vez mayor, la pérdida de especies es diaria, la deforestación de los bosques donde se alberga la diversidad es muy grande. Así que es muy importante tomar en cuenta las formas de vida que tenemos los pueblos indígenas para convivir con la naturaleza y que ha favorecido la conservación. Esta es nuestra gran propuesta para el marco post-2020, que se tomen en cuenta estas formas diferentes de relacionamiento con la naturaleza, que no podemos solamente esperar que la naturaleza nos dé, que nosotros también, todas y todos, los gobiernos, las empresas, los pueblos indígenas, las comunidades locales, tenemos que cuidar de la naturaleza y tenemos que darle de la naturaleza. La naturaleza no nos pertenece, nosotros hacemos parte de ella. Muchas gracias.
Yes.
Well, we've been asked several times this question about indigenous peoples' conservation and development, no? And I think we have to also disabuse ourselves of the notion that the idea of indigenous peoples, the concept of development for indigenous peoples is the same as everyone else. For example, our brothers and sisters in Vanuatu, when they were asked what their indicators for development, for a good life are, they mentioned the ability to practice their rituals, their spiritual activities, their ability to access their lands and carry out their traditional occupations, their ability to continue to use their traditional, their indigenous languages. So it's a very different conception. This is not to say that they don't want mainstream development. But you know, because of the close ties, the spiritual ties between indigenous peoples and nature and their territories, their resources, it makes them view the world a little bit more differently. We have many examples where indigenous peoples have been given resources in order to protect their land. So, for example, indigenous guardians have been given a monthly salary, and the community has been given compensation for activities that have been protecting the areas. And what do they do with the money? They don't build airports, they don't build large buildings. What they do is they invest it in boats, for example, to be able to patrol their area. They invest it, of course, in the education of their children, but they also ensure a pathway for the children to be able to come back and to be able to continue to live within community. So I think, of course, development is important for indigenous peoples, but we have to recognize that it's a slightly different definition of development. And this is what makes indigenous peoples good guardians of biodiversity and of nature.
Thank you, Jean. I see that we have 5 minutes left. Are there questions from the floor? I see one at the back.
Hi, I'm Murat Khan from Pakistan, here from Art Journalism Network. I'm a journalist. My question is, as all of us know that majority of the EG targets have not been fulfilled, And my question is that the target related to indigenous groups have been fulfilled or not? If not, how much you're hopeful that CBD will fulfill or it will be included in the post-2020 biodiversity framework?
Thank you for that question, and I think I can link it to this question that we received online, and this will be the last question for the panelists, so if we can keep our responses short. The question is, what are the challenges that you see that we must plan on and prepare to face this COP27? So if you can link that with the last question, Joji, and we can go through one by one.
Okay. The IIFB brought out an assessment of the Aichi targets. It's called Local Biodiversity Outlooks. It was revealed that less than 10 parties had included us in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And the activities mentioned in the reports are just piecemeal projects or activities rather than being fully incorporated within national plans. And traditional knowledge and measuring and the use of indicators was not actually used, right? So going forward, we really need to be completely embedded and supported in the national biodiversity strategy and action plans in order for that to be implemented. And actually, I'm hopeful, despite a systemic analysis of what's going on, there has been a sea change in the appreciation of parties that actually they really have to work with us nationally and locally in order that what is being discussed in the rooms can actually get implemented. Thank you.
To follow up on what Joji said, our actions at the local level are many times not recognized. But we, going forward, have to start to document. We have to produce the evidence that our work is contributing to the sustainable use of the resources. And that's why I said we, the local groups, are proactive. We know what we are doing. We know the contributions that we are making. So we can provide the evidence. And we want it to be in our national reporting from our NDSAPs. Thank you.
To the question that came online, it was on COP27, which is the climate change COP, and I do want to reflect on that because it is very relevant for biodiversity as well. I come from the Arctic, and we experience this strong push for green development, so-called green development in our areas, which are vast in territory and in mineral reserves. So everything that is coming to our territories now is brought in the name of the green shift and the demand for change and more sustainability. And in the name of sustainability, they are trying to destroy our territories and our connection to our lands. So there is definitely a link to climate change mitigation efforts. In the Arctic, we are facing strong need for adaptation as we are warming very rapidly. So we are facing this double burden at the moment. So there is definitely a link between climate change and biodiversity. Thank you.
Well, to follow on what has been said, there's no way that the post-2020 framework can be achieved without indigenous peoples. And that recognition is snowballing. The scientific evidence is also snowballing. And so now we're working very closely with parties, with civil society and groups of parties so that we can align. So the IIFB meets and we invite civil society so that we can work together. And we also have periodic meetings with the countries. But I think taking on from Aslat, well, the challenge is how to make biodiversity as sexy as climate change, because we're always the little sister, no? The news is always about climate change and everything. But for indigenous peoples, no, we don't separate the solutions at the local level. Everything we do, they address both biodiversity issues and climate change. So that link must be made, and that's a challenge to do in COP27. We must link it. And in fact, the IPLC pledge, which committed 1.7 billion for indigenous peoples, is about securing tenure for indigenous peoples, and that helps both biodiversity and climate change. And then maybe for the last part, loss and damage, because it's going to be in Africa. Loss and damage is going to be a very big discussion, and we hope that the non-economic losses of culture, language, traditional knowledge, can also be highlighted in that discussion.
También nos están preguntando cómo pueden los diferentes sectores trabajar en conjunto con los pueblos indígenas. Sobre esto hay que decir que este tema es importante para todas y para todos en el mundo. Creo que es necesario que los gobiernos, las empresas, las diferentes organizaciones de la sociedad civil, las comunidades locales, las comunidades rurales, las comunidades urbanas y los pueblos indígenas nos unamos en este propósito de cuidar esta casa común, lo que para los pueblos indígenas es la madre tierra, porque si acabamos con esta casa, ¿para dónde nos vamos a ir? Este es un reto para todas y para todos, y necesitamos que este marco sea muy fuerte, que realmente la ambición sea muy alta para poder cuidar esta casa, para detener la pérdida de diversidad, para detener el calentamiento global que cada día es mayor. Entonces creemos que todos podemos hacer diferentes acciones en este marco.
Okay, thank you very much. That ends our press conference. Main message: respect the rights, respect and protect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, so that the GBF will be a success. Thank you so much, and if you have more questions, approach the panelists. Thank you.